A controversial idea, taking guns away from Texans who could pose a threat to themselves or others.
I don't want to see another Santa Fe happen again.
State lawmakers are taking up the idea of a red flag law, and it's raising concerns about the balance of your rights versus your safety.
I think about the thousands of people who showed up. On that day, something really special happened.
It's been 5 years since Wendy Davis launched her famous filibuster to block anti-abortion legislation.
It was democracy perverted by mob rule.
Now, a new look at the filibuster and if it still has a lasting impact today. And politics hits the football field. We'll look closer at the new poll that shows Texans are turning against the National Football League. What's behind the change? Hello, and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. Texas lawmakers are looking into a red flag law to help prevent mass shootings. It would allow guns to be taken away from someone considered potentially dangerous. Proposals under consideration would allow law enforcement, district attorneys, school officials, or even family members to request that protective order from a judge. Wes Rappaport explains how tricky it is to strike a balance between protecting Texas kids while also preserving Second Amendment rights and due process.
You never get good policy when you base it off of emotion.
C.J. Grisham opposes red flag laws that could allow temporary restrictions on people who pose a danger. He attended a meeting of lawmakers openly carrying his handgun.
If somebody feels intimidated, I'm sorry, but liberty is not predicated on someone's feelings. So suck it up, Buttercup.
But Judge Guy Herman says allowing this temporary intervention could stop more deadly attacks like the one at Santa Fe High School.
I don't want to see another Santa Fe happen again. There was information out that maybe had it been given to the right persons that we could have put a stop to that.
While most who participated in Monday's meeting agreed something needs to be done to better protect Texans, some were less unified on the exact approach.
This is really a suicide prevention effort.
I know that the storage issue is a difficult one. It's difficult to enforce. It's difficult for some people to say, how are you going to tell me what to do?
We need to do something that actually works. The problem I see is that all the stuff that's become the cliches and the bumper stickers is not going to make a damn bit of difference.
Wes Rappaport for State of Texas.
Ideas from this hearing will be combined with information from future discussions and could lead to new legislative proposals next year. A Senate committee is slated to take up the discussion of red flag laws later this month. A few other states have similar laws. Connecticut was the first to implement it in 1999. Indiana followed suit in 2005, as well as California in 2014, Washington State in 2016, and Oregon last year. At least 24 other state legislatures are considering similar laws. A few of them saw bills filed shortly after the Parkland, Florida school shooting in February, but most were filed earlier. Texas lawmakers are divided on the concept of red flag laws, but there's widespread support in the ledge for getting more armed school security officers. One proposal would prioritize hiring veterans for the job, but as Steffi Lee shows us, the idea faces scrutiny at the Capitol.
When our kids go to school, we expect them to come home. And so we really have a complex set of issues to deal with.
One of those issues, finding the most qualified people to serve in school security and streamlining their training.
If you're looking at hiring veterans, people that have specialized training in law enforcement, as I did, there should be a consideration, maybe some modification, maybe reduce the amount of training.
Being able to attract someone in an SRO role to us is a little harder than what they can do, what we can offer in funding, what we offer in location.
Granger ISD Superintendent Randy Willis says the candidate pool could grow for his rural district if lawmakers prioritize veterans or retired peace officers to serve on campus.
A veteran that has police training, things like that, that should be more than adequate to be part of that quality pool for us to be able to choose from.
And some veterans stress that police training is key.
Handling a weapon in a school situation with a bunch of kids around is a lot different than in a combat situation or straight policing situation.
And handling an active shooter may require different skills.
Some people are cooks, clerks, Some people were military police.
Whatever lawmakers decide, Superintendent Willis hopes they'll add funding.
We're already stretched with our dollars.
Steffi Lee for State of Texas.
High school students came to the Capitol to make their voices heard in the school safety debate. Lawmakers on the House Public Health and Public Education committees held a joint hearing focused on mental health. Students testified about the importance of school counselors. They told lawmakers there are not enough of them, and the ones they do have are overworked.
Even if we were comfortable going and talking to that counselor, she's one of those people that is overrun by other tasks to do. She's either, doing the buses or in the lunch line or various things like that.
I think that if students can spend more time with their counselors, they'll feel more comfortable sort of going and talking to them when there's something difficult going on in their lives.
Lawmakers are also looking at ways to make psychiatric services for children more available in Texas.
If lawmakers want to stop school shootings, they need to know the things responsible for those crimes. But it's hard to find agreement on the causes.
Well, if you drill down, you see Democrats and Republicans having very different views with really no consensus in either group.
What new poll numbers show about Texans' priorities to protect schools and the challenges for lawmakers.
It became this thunderous, magical, most beautiful demonstration of what it means to live and participate in the democracy that I certainly have ever experienced.
It's a moment like no other at the Texas Capitol. A crowd in the gallery helped block an anti-abortion bill, but that bill eventually became law. So does the moment have any relevance now?
If you want to stop school shootings, you need to know what's causing them, but that's a problem for Texas lawmakers. They can't agree, and neither can the people who vote for them. For perspective, we turn to Jim Henson from the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. You just published a poll that looks at that and several other issues. Lawmakers really aren't agreeing on that one, really.
Yeah, we went and we asked Texans to comment on the potential causes for these shootings. We built the responses around what seems to be circulating in the legislature, particularly given Governor Abbott's response to the shooting. And what we found is that if you look at the array of implied causes and the remedies attached to them, that there isn't a lot of agreement. The number one response when we asked people to consider causes and then rank the most important one was poor parenting, and that was only chosen by about 19% of the sample. If you drill down, you see Democrats and Republicans having very different views with really no consensus in either group. Among Democrats, not surprisingly, about a third say that access to guns and insufficient attention to that is the main problem. Among Republicans, it's more individual causes like poor parenting or bullying. Both groups have a little bit of overlap when it comes to mental health. Both say insufficient mental health services for students are important, to the extent of about in the teens for each group, Republicans and Democrats. But even that, I think, Republicans look at that and they see mental health as kind of an individual condition. Republicans look at it that way. Democrats look at mental health and they see more of a systemic failure and a need for more service. Very Republican and Democratic ways of looking at things.
You looked at a lot of different topics. One of the interesting ones that we saw was the growing support for legalizing marijuana.
Yeah, we saw, continuation of a trend we've seen for the last few years in which there's overall movement towards, at the very least, acceptance of decriminalizing marijuana. So about almost 70% of Texans, including majorities of Republicans and Democrats, would favor making possession of small amounts of marijuana punishable by only something comparable to a traffic ticket. But we're also seeing more movement towards support for broader legalization in some ways.
One poll might surprise a lot of people. Many Texans are turning against pro football. What's behind that?
Well, what I would say is that they're not turning against pro football per se, we don't think. And the reason this has gotten a lot of attention, we provided an item to the people in the poll that was a very basic, what we call a fave-unfave. How favorably or unfavorably do you view the NFL? We didn't say anything about the NFL. We didn't say the game of football. But what we found was that overall only 26% had a favorable view, 47% had an unfavorable view. So you have to ask yourself, does that mean Texans are turning against football, which seems very unlikely? I think the biggest hint about what's going on here is you look at the racial breakdown, a real severe difference between how whites and African Americans view the NFL. Only 20% favorability rating among whites, 55% unfavorable. Among African Americans, 49% favorable, only 24% unfavorable. There's no direct evidence here, but the most plausible explanation here does seem to be that when you ask people about the NFL, at least as of right now, they're thinking about the politics of protests in the NFL, and that's really shaping a lot of these. I think it's the most plausible explanation for what we're seeing here, and we'll certainly be interested in looking into this more.
Well, let's turn to the November election. Sure. A lot of people are interested in the race for U.S. Senate.
Yeah, we found that Senator Ted Cruz had about a 5-point lead over Beto O'Rourke, which raised some eyebrows. It's the latest in a series of polls that have found that race, separated by less than 10 points, which is not what we would expect. But we also found in that race about 20% still had no attitude. And I think what you have to remember about this and other results are two things. One, it's still very early. It's July. Spring and summer, as we've done some research, we've put some research out there on this, always tends to not look like the final vote in October. Usually underrepresents the Republican votes in the final analysis. And the other issue here, this is a poll of registered voters. We don't know what a likely voter is right now, and we know that the composition of the electorate on election day or during early voting on election day, much smaller, significantly smaller than the registered voter pool, and that electorate looks much different. It's older, it's more conservative, it's more Republican than the overall registered voter pool. So, I think you have to look at this and see it as, to use the cliche, which I hate to use, but it's true. It's a snapshot at this time, and it's a snapshot of a broader share of the electorate than we expect to see show up in November.
Jim Henson, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
13 hours that rocked the Texas Capitol.
I see the evening as one of the ugliest nights in the history of the state of Texas, and something I'm ashamed of.
It's been 5 years since Wendy Davis mounted her famous filibuster. Now we're taking a new look at the moment and seeing what it means today to people for and against her stand on the Senate floor.
It was a moment that turned the nation's attention to the state capitol. Then State Senator Wendy Davis mounted a 13-hour filibuster that blocked an anti-abortion bill. That was 5 years ago. Now our partners at the Texas Tribune are taking a new look at the filibuster in an online documentary called 13 Hours to Midnight. It looks at how the event unfolded and if it still has a lasting impact today. Here's a clip.
Hundreds of loud protesters packed the state capitol. One lawmaker staged a filibuster that lasted hours.
That was quite a shocking day. Sitting up in that gallery with so much mayhem.
The first thing that pops into my mind is an adrenaline that went through the whole day.
I disagreed with probably most of what she said, but it was sort of the music of democracy.
There were so many women there that were just ignited.
It was democracy perverted by mob rule.
The media and those on the left looked at her as this kind of great hero.
The Texas State Senator that everyone is talking about, Wendy Davis.
Whereas we were all horrified.
I think about the thousands of people who showed up. On that day, something really special happened. Not only figuratively were their voices going to be present in that conversation, but quite literally, they were the magic that happened at the end of the day.
Joining us now for some perspective is Alana Rocha from the Texas Tribune, the lead reporter on this documentary. Even after 5 years, people you spoke with still have very vivid memories. I mean, I was there, you were there.
Yeah.
It was a wild night.
It was a wild night, and some of it was a blur, but some of it was crystal clear, and I think that's what we found in the 10 or so people we interviewed. Of course, some remembered it differently, depending on who we were talking to, but yeah, it's still very vivid.
Now, one particularly powerful part of the documentary was hearing from different perspectives on what the lasting impact of this was. Let's play a little bit of that segment.
Okay.
Frankly, I suspect it won't be really remembered because at the end of the day, not only did she fail at stopping this piece of legislation, she failed at running for governor, and people like winners.
I see the evening as one of the ugliest nights in the history of the state of Texas, and something I'm ashamed of.
Honestly, I would not be where I am today if it weren't for that night. It activated an entire new generation of young women who now follow elections and follow legislative session, so that way things like that don't happen again.
The special session was called and the bill did pass into law. Even in that perceived failure, we gained something so much more powerful. Young women around the country tell me why that moment changed their lives. And that's really what matters. In fighting, we move the needle.
Did any of those responses surprise you?
No. Again, the people we sat down with, it was about 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and it was really in the eye of the beholder as far as how they look back on that night. I mean, you heard Connie Burton, who ended up a Republican succeeding Davis in her seat. Davis didn't run for re-election. She, of course, lost the governor's race. And so some of that, I mean, it's interesting and it's, you know, genuine from the individual people. But, you know, you look at it energized women. But again, our voting record isn't great in the state. And how many of those people who were there that night or in protest since are actually making it out to the polls?
I think a lot of people expected, because it did, you know, have such a reaction among Democrats when we're talking about Wendy Davis.
Right.
You know, catapulted her to have the gubernatorial nomination.
Right.
I think a lot of people thought that it would end in her favor, but really voter turnout wasn't as much as what some people predicted. And I wonder if the party has thought things through after, you know, basing so much on that event.
Well, you know, and you talk to the Republicans that we sat down with, and they say, you know, that night, a lot of them, you know, speak to the theory that a lot of those people in the gallery that night were paid. But they said, look, you know, advance how many months later in the governor's race, and that's more reflective of where Texas is or where Texas voters are on the abortion issue, because she decidedly lost in that race. And so it wasn't really emblematic of where Texas is on the issue or where they are as far as voter turnout.
Now, we saw, you know, former Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst there. Many people felt like he lost control of the Senate and of the gallery and really should have stepped in to try to wrangle things a little faster. And one of his biggest critics was the man who is the Lieutenant Governor today, Dan Patrick.
Yeah.
Did this really help him get to where he is? I mean, he's really set the agenda to be a more conservative Texas today.
Dan Patrick declined our request for an interview. I asked David Dewhurst if this was his downfall, because of course this was a rallying cry from Dan Patrick or a talking point on the campaign trail. Dewhurst didn't really go there. He didn't think it was. I asked him if he had any regrets from that night, and he said the one regret he had was not having enough DPS troopers in the gallery to be able to clear it. He said that there was miscommunication that night, and he was very clear, he thought, in saying they needed to clear the gallery, which we know was what got them to the Democrats past the midnight deadline.
Now, the abortion debate is back in the headlines after Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy has announced his retirement. Some people believe that this departure could mean trouble for abortion rights supporters.
Yeah, and you hear, though, from Republicans who are saying, you know, we don't want a conservative or a liberal on the court, we want a constitutionalist, and they don't think that this issue, you know, making abortion illegal or not, is going to come before the court again anytime soon. But of course, we know that Trump is looking to nominate maybe somebody younger who will be on the court for decades, so it could have implications in the future. Maybe it'll energize more of these young people who were there in 2013 and still active today.
Before we end, you know, this event really was maybe one of the most powerful events that many people in Texas politics had ever seen. Do you think it's going to be a while before we see something of this magnitude again?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think we could have predicted that night, and I don't think we can, you know, right now we're in political times that are hard to predict and ever changing. I mean, just this week alone on the border issue and changes from Washington and things like that. So I think rely on my 8-ball that much, or crystal ball. So I'm not sure, but I think that people with social media and easier to mobilize, you could definitely see like something like this again in the near future.
You have to go to the Texas Tribune, their website, to see this. It's so good. Give you a lot of perspective. Alana,
Thank you.
Good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Texas could face some unintended consequences from President Trump's tough talk on trade.
We're putting tariffs on $50 billion worth of technology and other things because we have to, because we've been treated very unfairly.
But those tariffs could be taking a toll on Texas jobs, why the governor is now trying to get the president to change his mind.
Governor Greg Abbott is asking President Trump to reconsider tariffs because they could cost Texas jobs. In a letter sent Thursday, the governor wrote that he worried the tariffs could threaten future economic growth and warned about the unintended negative consequences of the tariffs. He wrote that the tariffs could hurt the state's oil and gas industry. That's because the impact on the price of steel and aluminum will raise the costs of drilling wells and building pipelines. The governor cited economists who say the U.S., quote, can expect to lose up to 1.5 oil and gas jobs for every steel and aluminum job that is saved by the tariffs. He also raised concerns about the effect of retaliatory tariffs from China on agricultural goods from Texas. But the governor also praised what he called the president's commitment to curbing unfair trade practices and putting American businesses and workers first. Thank you again for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We'll be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.